Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
We're back with a very special episode of the Leo Training Podcast. The guest for this episode is Dean Somerset. Dean is an exercise physiologist based out of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I have him on the show this week because he and Tony Gentlecore have just launched a brand new product called the Complete Shoulder and Hip Blueprint. So, of course, we're going to be talking about this brand new product and how it can help trainers, coaches, and clinicians, as well as the average Joe. But one of the other things we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is the hip structure and architecture, and how your individual structure can have a huge impact on your setup in the squat, the deadlift, and we're going to also factor in a little bit about the rowing stroke as well. So this is a great episode. It's a nice short interview here, about 45, 50 minutes, and Dean does a great job in providing some actionable insight and takeaways that you can implement into your training. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this special brand new episode of the Leo Training Podcast with Dean Somerset. Dean Somerset, welcome to the Leo Training Podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Not a problem. I'm very happy to be here. Glad you're able to take some time to listen to a weird Canadian talk about fitness stuff.
Well, I have to say, since Stu McGill recommended I connect with you at some point, I knew I would have to track you down, and I'm glad that we finally get the chance to rap a little bit back and forth.
I'm happy of that too, and I figure if anybody can give me a stellar recommendation, Stu's the guy to do that. He's a stand-up human being, one way or another, professionally, personally, great guy. Yeah,
he's awesome. Well, I'm super pumped to have you here. Been a big week for you and Tony Gentlecore. You guys just released a brand new product called the Complete Shoulder and Hip Blueprint. So I know you're super pumped about that. We're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to spend a lot of time talking about the hip. You have a phenomenal website, great resource, for trainers and clinicians out there. And so let's kind of just, before we launch into that area, I would love for you to just introduce yourself, where you're located in Canada, your background, and then kind of what you focus on in terms of your career and the demographic clientele you work with.
In terms of where I am, I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is very north of the Canada-US border. It's about halfway between Canada-US and the Arctic Circle. So it gets pretty cold here in the winters. I think minus 40 is a reality once in a while. And when I say that and people say, is that Fahrenheit or Celsius? It doesn't matter. It's cold, right? It's actually the same temperature at minus 40 Celsius and Fahrenheit. They kind of overlap at that point. But there was a couple of times where we've been colder than Mars. So that's always a fun little factoid to send out to people. It means that you just stay inside, work out in a warm gym, and study. That's about it. In terms of my background, I played a lot of sports when I was growing up. I didn't play them well, but I played them. Basketball, football, volleyball, track and field, some kickboxing in there. But the cool thing about doing a lot of very different sports is you learn different styles of training, and you also learn about how the body moves with different outcomes. I mean, what works really well in a basketball setting won't work at all in football because they're very different sports with very different goal outcomes. So that gave me a great experience to be able to say, I understand what these sports are about, even if I wasn't very good at them myself. I mean, somebody's got to sit at the end of the bench. It might as well have been me. I went through being a bad athlete, which also led to me being injured as a bad athlete quite a bit. I had ankle injuries, knee injuries, back injuries, pretty much the whole shebang. So I spent a lot of time kind of in between the two elements of what an athlete does. They're either training or they're in rehab. I developed a really strong affinity to the rehab end of things, but I figured when I got out of high school, maybe I would go into physiotherapy. But thinking about it, I didn't want to just do the rehab elements of things. I wanted to work in the gym setting with athletes, with people looking to squat and deadlift and bench press and become stronger and more fit overall. But I wanted to still involve some of that concept of, athletes are going to get broken, they are going to get injured, and they're going to want to be able to come back and train knowing that they have a myriad of injuries that are going to probably alter how they're able to train. So I wanted to learn more about that end of things so that I'd be more well equipped to be able to help people out when they come into the gym with, say, an old rotator cuff injury, a previous meniscal injury, or something along that lines. And you look at just the prevalency of injuries in the population, something like 80% of the population has low back pain. If I was a trainer who had no idea about what back pain was or what to do about it, I'd exclude 80% of my population right out the door. And I would be uncomfortable working with anybody who had back pain, which would make my programming way more, I guess you could say, timid than what it should be to be able to get that person to benefit. So my background came in kinesiology, being a really bad athlete, working in the rehab element of things, and kind of developing a bridge between where the clinician would leave off for the client to refer them out and then where the gym element of things would actually take over. So there's usually a pretty big disconnect between what is considered the healthy individual in the gym and the person coming in with a known medical injury. So if we have something like that where I can say, okay, I'll get you from where you are now to where you want to be, that makes my niche really targeted in that manner.
No, totally. And I guess it's important to point out too that just because somebody maybe like discharged from physical therapy, and they're cleared doesn't mean that they're like in a really good spot to like get back into the gym and kind of start hitting things in full on training mode.
Absolutely.
So would that be kind of accurate? Like you're kind of very position yourself to work with people as they're kind of coming out of that end of the spectrum?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at a lot of the clinical outcomes for many physical therapy programs, a lot of them are based on, can you get back to work? And can you do your job with a limited risk of a re-aggravation of the injury? But what we know about any injury pathology is the number one predictor of future injury is previous injury. So a lot of the time the physio will leave the person off because either insurance ran out or coverage ran out or something like that. And they'll give them a sheet of exercise to be able to say, here's your homework, you have to do this. But we know compliance is really low when we do that. And it's not necessarily the physio's fault or the patient's fault or anything like that. It's that when people don't hurt, they don't try as hard and they don't work as hard to get back to something or get up to a level of function that they need to be able to do the stuff they want to do. So when we consider what is it that's going to help a client or a patient get better results, obviously if it's something where they go from a clinical setting under supervision and care into a gym setting under supervision and care to kind of just continue that flow into the next phase, it helps them out a lot more to be able to have better consistency with their training. But the adherence to the program is also considerably higher too. And as a result of that, they wind up having less of a likelihood of re-injury in the future. And it just makes them stronger and better at the end of the day. And that's what I'm all about.
Yeah, that's the fun stuff, and it's super rewarding helping them get there, right?
Yeah. I mean, you get somebody who walks in with a limp, and after 2 or 3 weeks, they're not limping anymore. That's fantastic. Like, that's what makes me jump for joy kind of thing is when it's great if somebody loses 5 pounds and looks like they have one extra ab, but if you can make a meaningful difference in somebody's actual quality of life, like them being able to get off the toilet or get down to a toilet without fearing that they're going to hurt something, you can't beat that kind of stuff.
No, I 100% agree. It's I say it all the time, but you can have in 30 to 60 minutes, you can have a very big impact on not only how somebody feels like mentally and emotionally, but like physically really, change their day around. It's awesome.
Absolutely.
Very cool. So you kind of touched on what led you into your career from like your training and athletic experience, as well as the injuries and everything. So from there, was there something specifically that like piqued your interest in regards to hip, like just learning more about them and how it works, was it a combination of that was the type of student or clientele that you started to see more and more frequently?
Well, you look at a lot of the research out there, a lot of the thought processes that develop, whether it's for something like back pain, hip pain, knee pain, anything like that. A lot of people say point to the hip, because the hip has a major driving feature of what functions occur at the spine, whether it's through lumbar flexion, extension, whatever. The hip directs where the knee position goes in many ways along with the foot. So when you start looking at a lot of commonalities as far as injury mechanisms, but also performance benefit, the hip seems to be a major center of everything. And then when you have people that you work with and you teach them how to do things like a basic hip hinge or a squat pattern where they use their hips versus their spine, or you teach them how to do internal, external rotation movements, and they say, I can feel like I'm getting a training benefit, and I also don't feel problems with this problem all the way through, it makes a big difference as far as what their outcomes are going to be at the end of the day. I mean, my goal is to make sure that the clients see what their goals are, whether it's reduce lower back pain, get their knees stronger, go skiing or golfing, pick up the grandkids, whatever. If it's something where I can say, here's an easy pathway to get you there, I'm going to do it. And by training the hip, it seems to be a catch-all for a lot of things that we'll see on a daily basis with a lot of the common injuries, but also performance elements that we see with our clients that they want to achieve, whether it's deadlift 3 times body weight or run a marathon. The hips seem to be the center of power for that.
That's a great point. So do you think, you kind of use the phrase like catch-all, do you think that we're getting so much return because, at this point in society, we're spending more and more time sitting. So because we're losing the ability to, have that range of motion, that mobility, and a lot of people kind of have forgotten or have never learned how to hip hinge, that by kind of restoring and teaching them those movement patterns and stuff, that's really enhancing their quality of life like tenfold.
Absolutely. I mean, if you work with somebody who's 50 years old, who spent the last 30 years in an office setting where they sit for 40 or 50 hours a week, they've gotten really good at sitting, but it's made them a little bit less adapted to do things like stand and walk and run or garden or do whatever they need to do that way. If you're fortunate enough to work with young athletes, like 14 to 20, they typically don't have great posture to begin with because they're still developing, they're still learning how to exist in their own skin. So for them, teaching them how to do a hip hinge isn't a matter of necessarily reducing pain, but just getting them into good habits so that they can take them with them for the rest of their life. I mean, you could have somebody who's 14 years old who has a disc herniation just due to the fact that they did something that caused an injury, which means that then you definitely have to train them on how to hip hinge and reduce stress on their spine. But if you got a 14-year-old who's just a floppy bag of bones who's going through a growth spurt, they're probably standing with like really kyphotic posture and really slumping into chairs, which doesn't necessarily make them stronger, and it definitely doesn't make them healthier. So you teach them how to do a hip hinge, put them on the basketball court and teach them what that hip hinge means to their defensive stance. Put them on the football field, let them know what that means to their first step activation. Put them onto any athletic scenario that you want to put them into and teach them that this is directly connected to that, and they're going to light it up like nobody's business.
That's an awesome point. I'm so glad you made that. I worked with a ladies tennis team this past fall, and that was like one of the first things I was teaching them, because that's kind of, their sort of ready or receiving position as they get ready to volley or hit the ball back. And yep. I'm like, you need to be able to live there in that position. Yep. Like, get into that hip hinge position, be comfortable learning how to kind of shift your weight, back behind your heels. And yep. Saw a huge improvement throughout the course of the fall and being able to get them to move laterally and just be comfortable in there.
Absolutely. And typically, if I work with anybody who's had a history of athleticism behind them, how I teach a deadlift is I say, show me athletic ready stance. Every athlete knows what that means. Whether it's basketball, football, volleyball, track and field, anything like that, I say, show me your athletic ready stance. Even if they haven't played a sport in 20 or 30 years, they kind of go back to it because they've had it drilled into their head by boot camp coaches over the years. And a lot of the time they'll get close. They might not be perfect, but they'll be at least close. They know where it should be. And then we just adjust them a little bit from here and there and say, okay, here's your athletic ready position. Now, this is also your deadlift position. Maybe a little bit deeper to grab a bar, but your deeper deadlift bar grab position is an athletic ready position. This is where you get explosive power. And now let's transfer that into the weight. When you do that and you can teach people how to do that kind of stuff, hip hinge patterning becomes easy because it's related to what they understand and what they know. I
love that. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Okay, kind of so shifting gears a little bit, still staying on the hip, but yep. let's talk a little bit about FAI. Sure. What is that? And then what are some background information that kind of the general population or the gym goer may want to know about that as it relates to strength training?
Well, the biggest thing to think with FAI, it's a short form for femoral acetabular impingement. Essentially, that's where the femur of the thigh bone bangs into the acetabulum on the hip socket. So essentially you have bone-to-bone contact from some form of movement, whether it's deep flexion or internal rotation or something is happening where you actually have that really deep flexion occurring is typically the biggest one. But essentially, it's bone-to-bone contact that leads to either the initial irritation on the tissue that develops a soft callus on the bone. So think of it sort of like the calluses on your hands. You go and you deadlift and you get callus formation on your hand. If those calluses get really thick, they can impede your ability to do things like grab the bar in the future. And that's where you start having like ripped calluses come from. So if you have those calluses develop, that's not necessarily a bad thing by itself. But if they start ripping off and start becoming a problem, now we have to really worry about what's actually happening behind that. After that soft callus forms, if you consistently beat it up and bang it up, it doesn't rip off like your hand callus might, but it forms a hard callus where now it's actually bone material that's been laid down. And it makes it so that it's very difficult to be able to create that range of motion because now you have new bone laid down getting in the way. So essentially, the best way to think of it is, think about if you have a door that you want to shut. Normally, a door shuts nice and clean. But now we take a little piece of paper and we put it inside the door right where the jamb meets where the hinges are. So now you've got a little bit of irritation that's created a bit of thickness in that zone that makes it a bit difficult to be able to shut that door. Then you add another sheet of paper, a piece of plywood, a piece of cardboard, anything like that makes it tough to get that door to actually shut all the way without causing some sort of problem. So if you have that new bone laying down, now it makes it easier for you to actually pinch bone to bone, which makes it easier to reduce the range of motion and harder to get into some of the positions that you might want to get into. So get it. Yeah, you can go. You're getting ready.
Yeah. So my question is could that potentially, not saying this directly, but could that potentially over time, could that lead to like a labral tear?
Absolutely. You're pinching stuff in between two bones. So you could pinch the labrum just like you could the supraspinatus tendon coming out of the shoulder when somebody has a rotator cuff tear. The humerus glides up into the acromion and squishes everything in between it. So if I have the acetabulum in the femur and I go into that bone-to-bone contact, if the labrum is getting in between that, you can definitely pinch that. And especially if you go into a pinch point and then you create a shear force inside that point. So, I mean, a classic example would be a goalie in hockey. They stand in a butterfly stance where they're in a deep flexed knees together and internally rotated position where their feet are kind of kicked out. So that butterfly stance has been made classic by Patrick Waugh back in the 90s. And a lot of goalies have picked up. You stand in that posture all the time. And then you have to do quick jabs out and then right back in and then out and right back in. And it's with force. And not a lot of people have the hip anatomy to be able to do that well repeatedly over time. Typically, goalies are picked because they're fast and flexible, not necessarily to say they have the right hip socket to reduce that bone-to-bone contact. So if you have somebody that's got something more like an anteverted acetabulum, which is more of a tilted forward version versus a retroverted, which is tilted backwards, if I'm trying to go into deep flexion, I have way more range of motion before I have that bone-to-bone contact if my acetabulum is anteverted, versus if it's retroverted, I can't get to that same position before bone-to-bone happens earlier. And when that bone-to-bone contact happens, we can't really stretch into it. That's like me saying, I'm going to push my face into a wall and eventually get through the wall. I could, but something's probably going to go wrong. Either the wall's going to break or my face is going to break.
Right.
So if I stretch that bone into bone, I'm either going to develop irritation on the bone or it's going to lead to something like a labral tear or a muscle tear or something along that line. So you really can't do it well over time.
Wow. That's tons of information there. So I guess the next part I want to kind of connect to that is, so let's talk about how foot position can also play a factor into that.
Yeah. So if you think about what I was saying with anteversion and retroversion of the hip socket, we all have a degree of asymmetry between our hips. Like we're not perfectly textbook aligned where our feet are going to point straight forward. Quite a few people can have up to a 20-degree difference from left hip to right hip in that same person. And that could be from anteversion to retroversion, or it could also be lateral placement of that acetabulum. There could also be variations in the femoral neck. So what I found is that for a lot of people, if they try to force a symmetrical stance, whether it's feet straight ahead or feet angled out at the exact same point, lined up perfectly, if they have an asymmetry in their hip, but they take that symmetric stance, they may actually be creating an imbalance in their hips, not necessarily solving it. So think of it this way. What side of the car do you sit on when you drive? Probably on the left-hand side if you're in North America, or on the right-hand side if you're in the UK and in Australia. You're always asymmetrically set up into that car. You're not right in the dead center of that vehicle. So the weight distribution is a little bit different. And when we look at the wear patterns on tires and on suspension systems, they usually set it up slightly different between the left side and the right side based on where the person is going to have the greatest amount of weight distribution. And most people, if they drive the vehicle on their own, it's going to be the weight distribution on the one side wears down a lot faster. And if they're not setting it up to have that variation, it can be a challenge. When you look at NASCAR drivers, they always turn left. The car always turns left all the time. So they'll always include stiffer suspension on the right-hand side of the vehicle, stiffer, longer wear tires, because they know that that's the side that everything is going to get leaned onto and worn down sooner. The left side isn't really going to wear down quite as much because it doesn't get the same level of force because they never turn right. They always turn left. So if we always try to line our feet up exactly the same way, but we have that asymmetric structure or force distribution, we're creating the imbalance that we're trying to fix. So in many instances, it may be worth it for the individual to take one toe out slightly wider than the other, or even have that foot out slightly wider or back slightly compared to the other one to be able to accommodate for that natural asymmetry. And one of the easiest ways that we can tell whether or not that works for the person or not is just go through it very much like what an optometrist would do if they're trying to figure out where your glasses prescription is. So you just try a different stance and then you just say better or worse. Do you feel like that's an easier squat, a more stable squat, and a stronger squat? Or does that feel junky? Or does it feel restricted or painful? And then we go to another position. So very much like when the optometrist puts the lens in front of you and flips it back and forth, which one is better? Which one works better for your vision where you can see clearer? So all you do is just move your foot from parallel to slightly toe out to one toe out, the other toe out, move it out a little bit, move it back a little bit, and figure out what works. I mean, some people work really well with one foot turned out and slightly behind the other foot. Some people work well with both feet symmetrically. Some people don't work well unless they're above a certain height with the hip flexion. So in terms of what the average gym goer needs to know about that, don't force a position that's not comfortable for you, and don't force a position because you think it should be what's symmetric. If you need to, adjust it. Everyone's different, so take a position that works for you, not necessarily one that needs to be done based on a textbook that may not be aware of your natural asymmetrical qualities.
I love that. And so that's one of the great things about the gym, being on the floor is we can adjust our foot position as needed. So, yep. So I didn't have this down, but you made me think of it. So I'm slightly putting you on the spot, but this is a great question. So now let's think about the setup on a rowing machine or in a rowing boat, right? Yep. And so both are symmetrical. The feet are fixed. So on the rowing machine, you're using some straps and putting it over top of your shoes. In the rowing shell, your feet are in the boat. You can't turn the feet out, right? So that is in a fixed position. Yep. So taking that into consideration, how could that potentially, cause some dysfunctions up the kinetic chain?
So the big issue with that is, let's take a look at the injury patterns that occur with rowers. So let's assume that a rower is using double oar versus single oar, because if they're using a single oar, they're going to rotate to one side all the time on that side. If they're using a double oar, they're straight back. Would those rowers have bilateral injuries? Meaning, would both knees be affected at the same time? Would both hips be affected? Would both SI joints be affected? Would both lumbar spine, erector spinae muscles be affected? Or would one side be more affected than the other?
One side, I can tell you I had rib injuries on one side.
Rib injury, right? But somebody who's been a rower in the past, I'm assuming, you probably have a lot of teammates that have had one side dominant issues, right?
Yep.
And it might be if they're not doing single sculls, if they're doing double sculls or something like that, then they probably have maybe their right side is affected all the time. They have right SI joint issues, right hip issues, right low back issues. What is that telling you about the structure?
That they don't have the range of motion through that side of the body, probably that they need for that movement.
Yeah. Whenever you don't have range of motion, you're going to rob from Peter to pay Paul. If you don't have it in one place, you'll find it somewhere else. So let's assume that an individual has a perfectly symmetrical structure and they're doing a perfectly symmetrical event. They should develop injuries of overuse on both sides equally because both sides are working the same. Now, if we say, maybe one side is weaker or one side is tighter, how could that be if it's a symmetrical setup in a symmetrical sport? Both sides have to work equally. If you had one side that was weaker, you'd go in circles, right? Because both sides are pulling, and if you don't pull hard enough, you're going to wind up turning and wind up hitting the shore. So if you have a structural asymmetry, that could lead to an individual developing one side problems one way or another, whether it's a rib injury, whether it's a hip injury, whether it's an SI or whatever. If you're in a completely bilaterally symmetrical sport, but you develop asymmetrical injury histories, that's telling you there's probably something asymmetrical about your structure that isn't being addressed properly. Now, that's not to say that that's an easy fix, but it's just more like a clue to say, something may be going on here. And if we can see that there's up to a 20-degree difference between your left hip and your right hip in terms of whether one is turned out or turned left or whatever, if you force a position based on your good hip, but the other hip doesn't quite have the range to get there, you got to find it somewhere else. You'll flex on the lumbar spine on that side. You'll rotate your SI joint and create a shear force in it to be able to accommodate that range of motion. So a lot of rowers wind up developing left or right side SI joint problems when they're in a completely symmetrical sport. And you're probably able to say, yeah, I see that all the time with a lot of my teammates and my rowers. So in many ways, that forcing that symmetry is going to be great for the people who have the symmetry, but the people who are asymmetric, they're going to hate every single second of it.
Right. Now, do you think that's potentially, could it be, like you said, the asymmetrical hip structure, or could it potentially be, say, if they're a sweep rower, right? So they're only using one oar and they're only rotating out to one side, that they might be getting more flexion through that inside leg, that hip, versus the outside leg. So because they're not accessing that range of motion over a very long period of time, they lose it. Is that potentially also something that could be there?
It could be. And it might also be that maybe they're on a different side of the boat than what they should be, or where they have the greatest power. Right? Like some rowers find that when they're put on the left side, they feel absolutely dominant. But then when you put them on the right side, they have no idea what to do.
Right.
It's the exact same movement as far as like going back and forth, but the difference is just the direction of rowing and the direction of power. So it's a matter of, okay, well, how do we actually set that up? And a lot of the time in rowing, if you're in like eights or whatever, you're going to put people onto the sides of the boat to match up with their power and match up with their strength. So if you have all the, I guess you could say, weaker teammates on the left side and all the stronger teammates on the right side, you're going to, again, wind up going in circles and have to steer it a little bit differently. So you're going to match it up to say, we got one weak, one strong, one weak, and base it on how are you going to be able to get power distribution on the boat. Not necessarily saying that it's on what that athlete is stronger in, but it's just a matter of, okay, well, we're going to balance the boat out essentially to make sure we have the straightest line possible. Some athletes, they have the ability to be ambidextrous with it, which is fantastic, but very much like with the deadlift setup. Some people find that if they do an overhand grip like this, they love it. It lights right up and everything feels good. You do a deadlift grip like this, nothing else has changed through the chain except for where your shoulder and wrist position go. And everyone might find that, wow, this feels way different and I can't connect the dots with them. So when we're doing something like that one side dominant sport, you have to understand that it might be better for the individual to be on one side versus another, not necessarily due to muscle strength or muscle weakness, but that's just where their dominant side is. Just like I can't throw a ball with my left hand to save my life, I can throw one with my right hand, okay, but it's the same movement, but I have a dominant hand on one side versus another. I can have a dominant structure on one side or another to do a certain movement.
No, totally. And so to kind of illustrate that point in a different setting. So like I can go through full range of motion and get to the bottom on my right side for a pistol squat, like no problem. The left side, I feel like I have less stability. And I also feel like I kind of run out of room quicker, so to speak. So that was really interesting to me because I definitely feel like I have way less room inside that hip socket there.
Yeah. And I mean, it might be one of those things where maybe you do just need more specific training on the mobility or flexibility to access that range. Maybe you have an ankle injury on that side, or like you said, you had a rib injury. So maybe there are conflicting features that are leading into that with some musculoskeletal stuff. Or maybe it is that you do have an asymmetric structure. So, I mean, we can push and push and push against that as long as we want. But then sometimes it's actually freeing and liberating to say, you know what? I have differences between left and right. This is always going to be good for that. But I've got other stuff on this other hip I'm really good at. So maybe when you're doing your pistol with your right leg, you might be able to hit the splits with your left leg out in the front and slightly kicked out to the side because you take advantage of that angle, or maybe not. So, I mean, you might have one hip that's really good at doing some stuff and then a hip that's really good at doing other stuff.
Totally. Which leads me to my perfect segue into, let's talk about your brand new product, all right, and how that can help just about anybody, trainers, clinicians, the average Joe, learn more about the shoulder and the hip, how they work together. So it's called the Complete Shoulder and Hip Blueprint, You guys,
Yep.
you and Tony, Gentle Core, just launched it this week.
Yep.
So go ahead, tell us all about it.
Well, Tony and I have been teaching this workshop across North America and parts of Europe for the better part of the last 18 months. And every time we've taught it, we've asked for feedback on it from all the attendees. What can we do to make it better? What can we do to provide a better experience? What information do you feel this might be missing, or what do we need to do a better job on? And every time we've taught the workshop, we've evolved it. And the workshop that we filmed in Oslo, Norway, was the last iteration of it with the most advanced concepts that we were able to put together, up-to-date research. Our flow was working really well with it. And essentially it talks about, shoulders and hips, just like we say. But these are two joints that I think get either really nailed down with specific detail that doesn't mean anything, or they get so overshot with concepts that it becomes almost superfluous. So we talked about things like, how do you assess the shoulder for the job that you want to do? Are you working with somebody who's like an overhead athlete or a guy who's working at a computer all day long? They have very different demands on those shoulders based on the fact that they do different things with them. So what kind of stuff do you need to look for with computer guy versus the overhead throwing athlete, like your volleyball players? On top of that, like, what do you do for your assessment? And then do they need to do specific correctives? Like, if you have a computer guy who sits at a desk like this, are we going to be able to overhead press them on day one? But what about if they can't actually rotate their shoulder blades up into a position where you can actually get them to overhead press? So what do you do about things like overhead rotation, scapular retraction, depression? How do you actually get thoracic mobility to allow all that to happen? Can breathing drills assist you in actually creating that mobility in very instantaneous manners? For the hip stuff, we go through a lot of the same elements as far as like, how is the hip related to low back pain, SI joint pain, FAI? Can we actually train the hip in multi-patterns? How do we look at asymmetry, and how do we actually determine that asymmetry in the individual and then tune their positioning to be able to get the best bang for the buck? So if we're looking at an individual who has a great asymmetry between left and right pelvis, can we actually squat that person or have them deadlift in a way where they're seeing strength development and PRs? And how do we do that? So like I said, you might have to turn the toe out or move the foot back, but sometimes it just comes down to playing around with it and seeing what happens. Is there a mismatch between what their passive mobility looks like and their active mobility, how they're able to access it and use it? And if so, what do we actually do about that to fix the problem? So if I have somebody where I can grab their leg and move it through a range of motion, but then I get them off the table and they can't get even 10% of that range, they have the mobility. They just showed me on the table that we could access that range of motion, but they can't figure out how to get to it. So the corrective strategies of how do you utilize as much active range of motion as possible within their passive range of motion features, and then build it up from there.
Wow. I'm just envisioning right now Keanu Reeves from The Matrix. I'm just trying to download all that. So that's a lot. I'm just processing. No, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. So one last thing, like if you're somebody who has a strong anatomy physiology background, like trainers, physical therapists, chiropractors, you're going to love all this kind of stuff because it's right up your alley. Plus, it's going to give you a lot of the technical elements of like, here's the exercises, here's the programming, here's how to go through it. If you're an average gym goer who likes talking about anatomy and physiology, we don't go too deep down the rabbit hole, but we do give a lot of hands-on stuff as far as like, here's exercise demonstrations, coaching cues. It's probably about 50% of that element of things. So even if you're not the strongest in anatomy physiology, you'll walk away with a lot of information you can use on day one to help you get better results in the gym.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And that's kind of really important for someone like myself too, because even though I'm a trainer, my background and education is mostly in marketing and business development. So my roots and strength are not from the, exercise science or anatomy physiology. So I'm constantly trying to improve and learn in that area. So that helps on all fronts, and that's great. That's awesome.
Absolutely. Like we wanted to make sure that it was something where if a trainer had only a weekend certification and they just got out of class last week, that they'd be able to come into the workshop and be able to say, okay, I have stuff I can take with me and go away and do stuff. We also wanted it to be at the level where if somebody had been a physical therapist for 20 years, that they could leave and say, oh, cool, I've got some new wrinkles that I can apply here and there. If they were a trainer working with Division I or pro athletes, they'd be able to assess them a little bit more effectively. And we wanted to make sure that people could see that, you know what, we're not just in this for here's our system, here's what you have to do. We left it as wide open as possible so that we could say to people, here are the principles. If you use those and you enjoy them, we don't care what exercise you pick. We'll show you a whole bunch of them, but if you have better ones, use those.
Awesome. Totally. This is great. I can't wait to check this out. So that's on the content sort of end and what they're going to learn and everything. Where do we go? Where can we get it?
To pick up your copy, I'm sure you're going to have a dedicated link somewhere at some point when you put this up, but
Sure.
www.completeshoulderandhipblueprint.com. If you want, Joe will put up a link to it and make sure that you have access to it as well.
Yep, absolutely. I'll include it in the show notes and everything. And it's, just correct me if I'm wrong, 11 plus hours of video footage, right?
Yep, 11 plus hours of video that we shot in Oslo, Norway with a professional film crew. You get continuing education credits through the NSCA. If you have certification through other organizations, you can actually petition with these credits. We've had really good success with people petitioning for a whole bunch of different organizations. So if you're certified with other than the NSCA, you shouldn't have any kind of problem with it.
Awesome. That's great. And that's huge too, because we all need the CEUs.
Absolutely. You got to stay on top of things. But the funny thing is that so many organizations require the continuing education to be done, but a lot of them don't necessarily check to see what you learned from it. It's more just like, oh, well, just show up and get your credits and away you go. So hopefully people actually show up, get the credits, but then use stuff on the way forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. They do just sort of make sure you check the box, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Is there anything else that you want to touch on in regards to the brand new product?
I think people are really going to like it. Essentially, we use a really good combination of cat memes, humor, the odd bit of pop culture references, and then we also talk about things like anatomy, physiology, training people up, getting them going. So we try to make it as much of an entertaining value for the individual as it is something that's information. There's nothing worse than listening to hours and hours of anatomy, physiology, and coaching where it's completely dry information. You feel like you're reading stereo instructions. Essentially, we wanted to make it where people are kind of hanging on what we're doing and drive it forward.
No, totally. And I've been reading your blog and Tony's blog for quite some time, and you guys definitely have a great way of communicating the information where you're learning a lot, but it's fun and it's funny. There's a good sense of humor to it. So it's it makes it, it's not as, I guess, sometimes it can be intimidating when you're learning this stuff, Yeah. So it's easier to wrap your head around it for sure. That's awesome.
Absolutely. Humor has a great way of disarming people and making it so they want to pay attention. So if I can get people to want to pay attention to what I'm saying, my message is going to get through a lot clearer.
100%. Totally. All right. You ready for rapid fire?
Lightning round time?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Cool. All right. So first question here. Given all your knowledge and all of your experience at this point in your life, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself 15 years ago?
Advice I give myself 15 years ago would say to study business sooner and look at how I can actually utilize principles rather than just saying, okay, get really good at just training elements of things. How can I actually utilize different principles of business to develop myself as a professional faster? It was about a year into when I was a personal trainer and my business was actually struggling significantly, and I was thinking of giving up as a trainer, when I actually walked into bookstores and started saying, instead of going to the exercise section, I'm going to go to the business section and learn about things like sales techniques, the psychology of purchasing, all that kind of elements of things. If I would have done that when I was in maybe first year university and gone through both education simultaneously, who knows, I might be in a different position than I am now, but I would still be delivering and working on my passion, but I just wouldn't have had to struggle as much going forward. Right
on. Awesome advice. If you had to pick one, what's your favorite strength training exercise?
I usually don't like to pick one because, why do one when I can do them all? But deadlifts are definitely up there, but squats are a definite favorite of mine as well. I haven't done them in nearly long enough, but I've said this a couple of times. I think walking is a very underrated exercise. Mm-hmm. You get a lot of benefits from it in terms of strength, cardiovascular, and also just getting out into your environment and seeing things. Maybe bench press. Everyone's got to have pecs, right?
That's right, man. I love it. That's awesome. How has your training changed present day compared to 15 years ago?
About 15 years ago, I was still thinking I was an athlete and I was doing a lot of the sport performance elements of things, which is fine and good. I was also involved in quite a bit of bodybuilding style training, so looking to get jacked and swole. Now I do a lot more heavier strength training with moderate to high volume kind of stuff. So I never push myself for full failure because as somebody who's not looking to be a power lifter, why would I need to figure out what my true 1 rep max is when I can do here's a 2 or 3 rep max or a 1 rep where I feel like it's an 8 out of 10 effort. I'm not necessarily pushing myself to the limits as much as I was when I was 20. And that's because I have different values right now. Like when I was 20, if I ripped my pec, I could still go and sit in class and learn stuff. Whereas now if I like rip my patellar tendon off, I can't train clients, and that's an income source. I have a family that I have to support. So I have to think about the end result of that kind of stuff a little bit differently. So in terms of why I'm training and what I'm training, it's usually a little bit less, I guess you could say, stupid on the risks that I'm taking, and more, I guess you could say, laser focused.
Awesome, man. You've already touched on your injuries that you've had and how that affected your career and your training.
Yep.
So what's one thing that high school athletes or junior athletes should be doing more of to complement their training and their health?
Understanding that what you do now is going to pay off 10, 20, 30 years from now. And it's not something where it's like, oh yeah, I'll worry about it when I get there. Worry about it now so you don't have to worry about it when you get there. So learn how to do basic movements. Don't worry about trying to dunk if you don't know how to dribble. And get to the stage where you're like, okay, I'm not going to put myself at risk needlessly just to be able to show off for my two buddies in the gym when it's all pitch black and dark. Learn how to deadlift versus trying to throw 4 plates aside on and do a black cat deadlift where your back runs and now you can't feel your toes for the next 5 days. So make it something where it's like, you know what, I'm going to perform really well, but I want to learn how to perform better and take care of myself today so that I don't have to work as hard to take care of myself in 10 or 20 years.
Awesome. I never heard that one before. The black cat deadlift. That's it's good. I like that.
The deadlift is like,
yeah. All right. What's your best tip to improve recovery post training session?
Get a better sleep. I mean, we could always talk about, oh, you need to do an Epsom salt bath, you need to drink, you need to eat X number of grams of protein, but get a better sleep. Whether it's get longer time in bed or get a deeper quality of sleep, have the blackest room you can possibly imagine, turn off all sources of lights, leave your cell phone out in the living room instead of in the bedroom. Try to make it as pitch black bat cave style as you possibly can, and then just try to zonk out for 8 to 10 hours if you can. That is going to improve recovery more than anything else you try to do during your waking hours.
Awesome. What's your favorite meal?
My wife is actually getting into cooking pretty hard right now, so I get a good chance to have a lot of really good things going on my plate these days. The other night, she made sweet potato gnocchi with the brown butter and sage, and I was just like, wow, this marriage just got interesting. I'm liking this. All right. It was interesting before, but now it's like, okay, we're going. But a lot of the time, roast chicken or steak. That's usually my go-tos. And then I load up on vegetables and keep the carbs more as like a breakfast or lunch kind of thing. But any kind of protein is good protein.
Nice. Mm-hmm. What's one book everyone should read?
Everyone, whether they're in training or not in training?
Yeah. So genre, it does not have to be a specific genre. Any book.
Oh, man. I think Hemingway is a great example of somebody to read, but it's one thing to look at the story. It's another thing to look at the backstory within the story itself. So if you're reading something like The Sun Also Rises, that would be a great example of a book that everyone should read at one point in time of their life or another. The main reason is because, like, if you just read the story for what it is, that's great. But if you look at how the character develops over time and the intrigue within the relationships between characters, that's an amazing interplay and show of what literary greatness actually is. So I think that people should look at books like The Sun Also Rises to be able to say, you know, here's a great example of layers of storytelling, not just a superficial layer.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Final question. Who have you studied or do you continue to study in your career to improve, to get better?
There's a lot of people out there that everyone that listens to your show probably also listen to, like Gray Cook, Thomas Plummer, Eric Cressy, Tony Gentilcore, of course, Stu McGill. All those guys have great knowledge and insights into what they're doing. I tend to also look outside of the industry as well. So if you look at individuals who are running very involved business development concepts, like Ramit Sethi or Tim Ferriss or, oh God, what's the guy's name? Seth Godin. Any of those guys have amazing abilities to teach, but also relay information to show that they truly master their craft. And it's not something where it's like, oh, you know what, I ran a startup business and it sold really well on day one and I haven't had any success since. These are guys that have had track records of success across years, across businesses, across various entrepreneurial elements. Other people that definitely should be looked at would be individuals like Tim Cook, Steve Jobs, the guys who have been CEOs in Apple at one point or another. Also, I'm reading the story of BlackBerry, which talks about how guys like Jim Balsillie came into actually running BlackBerry, as well as the head engineer. I can't remember his name, but their story is actually very similar to Apple in the fact that they had Gary Wozniak and Steve Jobs. So they had the marketing business guy and then also the technical engineering guy. So talking about what the needs are for businesses to be successful, you need to kind of have people that are specialists in their fields and be the best at what they can be. So if Steve Jobs was an engineer, he wouldn't be the salesperson. If Steve Wozniak was the business person, he would suffer immensely because he was an engineer. So you look at where those two guys' skill sets were, they complemented each other so well and fit the end pieces into the puzzle so well that their business was able to thrive. If they were both the same person, either two engineers or two business people, they wouldn't have produced a great product and they wouldn't have been able to tell the world about it. So being able to learn from people that are highly successful in that kind of stuff with different disciplines becomes massively impactful.
Awesome, man. Awesome. That is great. Well, Dean, this has been a real treat. I'm glad that we got to do it and put it together so quickly and everything.
You bet.
So thank you so much for coming on. Just hang on the line. Let me give you a proper goodbye offline.
Sounds good, man. Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully your readers and listeners got a lot out of this too.
Oh, I did. So I know they will for sure. 100%. Thank you.
You bet.
I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Leo Training Podcast. Be sure to tune in on Monday, November 7th for another brand new episode. That will be with Senior SFG Pavel Masic.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.